Do you say yes when you really want to say no, leaving you feeling exhausted, depleted, and even resentful? Well, in this video, I'm going to teach you how to say no guilt-free. Hi, I'm Ashton, HSP psychotherapist, HSP myself, and helping other HSPs live a life they love. So first we want to take a look at what is a boundary. A boundary is a spacer. It's something that creates space between you and something else. So for example, you could think of the boundary on a soccer field. That's a pretty obvious boundary. It's actually marked with lines on the soccer field. If something is out of bounds, it's on the other side of the boundary. If it's in bounds, it's inside the soccer field. Those kinds of boundaries are pretty easy to see and understand. Some of these boundaries that we're talking about are not quite so visible. So let me teach you the 3 types of boundaries. We have rigid boundaries. You could also think of another word for that would be impermeable. I don't know if you remember back to biology class and when we talked about cell membranes. And so there are some cell membranes that are impermeable, meaning nothing gets in or out of the cell. Those are the rigid boundaries. We also have open, no boundaries. That's a pretty obvious one. You could think of an example would be, let's say a parent using drugs with their children, or a parent telling their child about their sex life. That's an example of not having boundaries. The healthy boundaries are called flexible boundaries. And you could think of, back to biology, you could think of semi-permeable membranes. So some stuff gets in and other stuff doesn't get in. So an example of a rigid and a flexible boundary. So let's say you have a teenager, or maybe she's a tween, and the rule is you cannot go out on a school night. So a rule is an example of a boundary. So your teenager can't go out on a school night. And if you had flexible boundaries, it's her best friend's birthday, and she says, Mom, I just want to go over to Sally's house and have some birthday cake. And if your boundaries were flexible, even though it's a school night, you would say, okay, it's a school night. I want you to be home by 7:30. A rigid boundary would be, it's a school night. The rule is no going anywhere on a school night. You can't go. So with the flexible boundaries, which are the healthy boundaries, we want them to kind of bend and change somewhat with the circumstances that are going on, just like the birthday example. So how do we set healthy boundaries guilt-free? Well, the first thing I would say is you have to know yourself. Are you a morning person or are you an evening person? So I'm a morning person. So for example, my phone goes off at 7:00 at night. I don't see patients on evenings or weekends because my boundary is my weekends are my time or my time with my family. Having a boundary doesn't mean that you have to say no all the time. You could say yes with a limit, like, yes, I will come to that party and I'm only going to stay for an hour. You could say, yes, I can help you with that. And no, I can't help you with that right now. So you have to take care of yourself first. If you don't take care of yourself first, you're no good for anyone else. For those of you who have flown in an airplane, they say when the oxygen mask drops, whose oxygen mask you put on first? You put on your kids and your husbands or your partners or your best friends? No. You put your own oxygen mask on first, because if you don't have the oxygen, then you'll probably pass out and you can't help anybody else. Know yourself, know your limits, and then you have to start practicing asking for what you need. So asking for what you need is another example of a boundary. People often think that just saying no is a boundary, and it's a both and. It's being able to say no. That doesn't work for me. I can't do that. I can't do that right now. and asking for what you need. I really need to have some me time tonight for an hour. I really need to have a couple hours on the weekends to go for a walk in nature. And so for HSPs, we especially have difficulty setting boundaries. We have higher levels of empathy than non-HSPs. And we really can feel sad, or we don't want to say no to other people because we don't want them to be upset. And when you start practicing putting boundaries, you might get pushback in the beginning, and that's okay. It's practice, practice, practice. And if you set a boundary and you feel guilty, then that's when you want to start having a look at your negative self-talk. What am I saying to myself? Am I telling myself that I'm a horrible person because I said no, or I'm unkind because I said no, or I'm not helpful because I said no, or I'm not a good friend because I said no? I know for me, sometimes asking for what I need, I can feel like I have too many needs, and that can be pretty common with HSPs as well, because we actually do have more needs than non-HSPs. We have a finely tuned nervous system. And so you could think of like an HSP like an orchid. And an orchid, it has more needs than, say, a daisy. A daisy's cool, but a daisy is a weed, and it could grow anywhere. An orchid, it needs pretty much the right amount of sunlight, the right temperature, and the right amount of water, and then your orchid's going to grow. So an HSP is like an orchid. Yes, we have more needs. So an orchid doesn't feel guilty about asking for what it needs or getting its needs met. I mean, clearly, plants don't have feelings and emotions. So it's just an example. So with practice, you can start asking for what you need without feeling guilty, and you can start saying no. So if you found this helpful, how to set boundaries, check out the link below and grab my free guide where I talk to you more about knowing your limits. And remember, when you understand your sensitivity, you can embrace it as your greatest asset.